Hillary, I'm going to let you take it over from here. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you so much. I am excited to be here and humbled to have such a great turnout. I'm excited to talk about this. Like Ashley said, my name is Hillary Owen. I am an LCSW located in Dallas. I have spent the last 15 plus years of my life working with children, adolescents, and families, and really am passionate about attachment and attachment trauma, which I hope will show through today. My clinical background, I did my practicum at the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center. I also spent several years working with New Friends, New Life, which is an agency in Dallas that serves women and teens who have survived sex trafficking as well as their children. And I have now been in private practice for just about 2 years and really specialize in treating people who have attachment trauma. On a personal note, I am a foster parent and have been for about 5 years in Dallas County. You'll get to hear a little bit about that today in my presentation, but my passion for attachment theory and attachment trauma and the impact of that on adults, families, and children, not only does it impact and influence my clinical work, but it also is a massive part of how I approach my parenting. We also have 2 biological children, and you'll hear maybe a little bit about them today too. So I'm going to share my screen and we will get started with my presentation. All right. So today's goals. I am an agenda gal, so I'm going to just run through what I hope to accomplish today. My goal is to spend the first roughly hour giving presentation, and then to spend the last chunk of time answering any questions that come in. So the first goal for today is for us to have a really clear definition of trauma and attachment, to identify the differences in single incident trauma, complex trauma, and attachment trauma. To provide a basic understanding of how EMDR therapy works and how it's facilitated, and then specifically to explain ways EMDR can address the deep wounds of specifically attachment trauma. For those of you who work, it sounds like lots of you work in the field or have experience in working with people with attachment trauma, you know that those wounds and traumas don't always present in the same way as other ones. And so my hope is to give you a lot of hope and to empower you that there is a really bright future ahead, even for those who've had a really, really terrible past. So let's just start by defining trauma. Judith Herman, who is to me one of the sort of heroes and trailblazers as it pertains to treatment of trauma and recovery. She wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, defines it as this: psychological trauma is an affiliation of the powerless. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evoke the response of catastrophe. A second hero, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, writes that trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people. I think it's really important to start with these quotes, because what I hear in my practice and what I hear just in talking to people about trauma all the time is that people often like to dismiss what happened to them, that it wasn't that bad, or it doesn't qualify for whatever reason. And if you will notice that in both of these definitions, and in any definition that I can find on trauma, that there's no comprehensive list of what qualifies as trauma and what doesn't make the cut. That at the end of the day, trauma is about our response. It's about our nervous system, our skill sets, our emotions being overwhelmed beyond what we have had to adapt to in the past. And so we're going to talk more about how that impacts our brains and how that impacts our behavior after it happens. So today you're going to hear me reference this quote and use this as a foundational understanding of trauma and the treatment of trauma and attachment. And that is that neurons that fire together wire together. And I want to start by just showing this brief clip from Inside Out, which to me is just an incredible illustration of this quote, that when we experience something, our brain creates a neural pathway for that. So let's watch the quote or the movie. I will tell you that the sound is not great, so I'm going to turn on closed captioning, but also at the same time, you can just see the visual, which is the most important part of this.
No, that's not to brag. But the really important ones are over here. I don't want to get too technical, but these are called core memories. Each one came from a super important time in Riley's life. Like when she first scored a goal. It was so amazing. And each core memory powers a different aspect of Riley's personality. Right? The island. Goofball Island is my personal favorite.
You little monkey.
Yep, Goofball is the best. Friendship Island is pretty good too. Oh, I love Honesty Island. And that's the truth. And of course, Family Island is amazing. The point is, the islands of personality are what make Riley, Riley.
Good night, kiddo.
Like that. Ooh, we're out. What I'm talking about. Another perfect day. Nice job, everybody. Let's get those memories down the long term.
All right, we did not die today. I call that an unqualified success.
Our girl. Oh, she's got great friends and a great house. This couldn't be better. After all, Riley's 11 now. What could happen?
Okay, so you saw in that video the inside of 11-year-old Riley's brain, and you noticed how as she had core memory experiences, things that stand out to her, that her brain created a neural pathway of that. You also saw that at the end of the day, when she went to sleep, assuming that she got a good night's sleep and went into that deep REM sleep, that the majority of the memories of the day fell off into her long-term memory. And only the ones that were really emotionally charged, in this particular case, they were all positive, remained, and they created a neural pathway. So let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like as it pertains to trauma. So when I first learned about trauma, I learned what those of us who work as therapists or who work in the field as professionals would refer to as single incident trauma. So a single incident trauma, most importantly, is defined as something that happens where there is a period of safety both before the incident and after the incident. And the period of safety following the incident, more specifically, must be 60 days or more. So examples of this would be, like I put on the slide, a car accident, an isolated assault, a single injury, something sort of random. And I like to think of it as a safety sandwich. So you had no exposure to the traumatic material or incident, something happens, and then you have that 60 days or more of safety after. So let's just say that a single incident trauma happens. How would that then be stored in your brain if we use this idea that we just saw in Inside Out of the neurons that fire together, wire together? So when something happens, your brain creates a neural pathway for that. And that memory gets stored with some charged material. And so what types of material would that be? So in this case, the trauma is stored as a consolidated memory. So you can see it's sort of in a circle right here, the yellow circle in the brain, and that there are likely resiliency factors or other positive neural networks to counterbalance. So we saw this in Riley's brain. She had Hockey Island, she had Goofball Island, she had Family Island and Friends Island. So she had all of these positive experiences. And if you've seen the movie, you know that later she has some negative experiences. And so a negative or a traumatic neural pathway would be created. So another way to analogy for this would be if you had an injury. So say you broke your arm and that wound was not properly treated. And so therefore, when the wound heals, it forms scar tissue and maybe it heals improperly. So when a traumatic memory is stored as one of those memory networks like we saw in the movie, what's attached to it? What types of things differentiate a traumatic memory from a regular memory? So we would say that one of the biggest things is that it's associated with a negative belief about oneself. So something happens and it is stored in our body as if it is a negative belief. So I'm going to give you a specific example from my own past in a second, but just remember that is one of the more important parts of a traumatic memory is that it's stored alongside a negative belief about oneself. It's also stored with negative emotions, of course. In Inside Out, that would be like the red or the blue balls. A lot of times that memory is stored with images that stand out to us. So, and they often resurface as flashbacks or sort of like a negative deja vu moment. It's stored with sensory material. So things related to sight, smell, taste, touch, etc., and body sensation. So it's stored in a way that is connected to the way my body feels. So when I remember that event, when that neural pathway is lit up, all of these things are associated with it. So on a normal day, let's just say that you lived a normal day, nothing particularly great happened, nothing particularly negative happened. Just like we saw in the movie, you go to sleep that night, you enter your REM sleep, most of the day's memories fall off into the background into what we would call our long-term memory. When we have something particularly good or particularly negative, so we saw some particularly good core memories in the clip, like I said, the hockey and the goofball and friends and family, those are stored with all of that charged positive content. So positive belief of herself, positive images, positive sensory material, positive emotions and body sensations. But the same is true of traumatic incidents. So when we have that trauma happen, it's also stored, connected to all of that stuff. It's just in the traumatic instance, it's connected to things that are negative. So when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I experienced what we would call a single incident trauma. My family went on vacation to a place to like a resort on a beach. And my dad had a history of being a pretty skilled sailor, and he liked to sail. They're called catamarans, which is like one of those smaller sailboats that has a kind of a trampoline on the top as the place where people sit. So my brother and sister and I and my dad went on this sailboat. And it started off really exciting. He was, of course, really excited to share this experience with us. And about 20 minutes in, we're headed out from the shore and a massive storm rolled in. And so my dad decided to turn us around and go back to shore. Like I said, it was just the 4 of us. I'm the oldest in my family. And so I was kind of like helping him maneuver the sails. He was, trying to teach me. And we started to turn and the sail was not released fast enough and the boat capsized. And it took my brother and sister and I underneath it. We were all wearing life jackets. And so we were stuck underneath the boat. It was extremely terrifying. My dad ended up being able to pull me out, and my brother and sister ended up being fine. My dad pulled me out. And then when I came out, there was a shrimp boat coming right at us and was like in the direction, was about to kind of like scoop us up. And then kind of like Baywatch style, we had jet skis come and rescue us and take us back to the shore. So ironically, this is the very first target, which is what we would call a memory that is traumatic in EMDR, that I worked on myself in EMDR. I did this as a part of my basic training when I learned EMDR. So I'm going to use this as an example of how this memory was stored for me as a single incident trauma. So the boat incident happened. The negative images I have of that were the image of the shrimp boat, like I told you, kind of coming right at us, and also an image of being underwater and not being able to breathe and not finding a way to get out from underneath the boat. Obviously, two very upsetting images in my memory. The sensory material connected to that were salt water, and then the sound of wind kind of blowing the sails, that like loud flapping sound. The negative thought was, it's my fault. Like I said, I was helping my dad with the sail, and the reason we capsized was because the sail wasn't released. And so in my mind, it was my fault that we flipped. I had a lot of shame and fear related to that. And body sensations, I feel tightness in my chest, like I can't breathe. And my arms kind of get tingly, like I start to lose feeling in them. So when we talk about how a traumatic memory is stored in our brains, and we say it's charged with content, the memory is stored with all of these pathways connected to it. And so when we think about that quote, when neurons fire together, they wire together, what that tells us is that anytime I experience any of these things connected to this traumatic memory, it's going to send a message to my brain as if that memory is happening again. And so we, of course, would call that a trigger. It's almost like if your memory was just like a very long file or a very long card deck. This memory, this traumatic memory, is sticking out, and it has all this stuff attached to it that then when we experience it again, gets brushed up against it. And that causes our brains and our bodies to feel as if we are reliving it. So the reason why I wanted to share this incident is because, number one, I've done a lot of work on it, and so I no longer feel the traumatic response to it, but also to share the difference between a single incident trauma like this and one that might turn into later PTSD. So PTSD would be when we have those neural pathways present. But then, different than this incident, this boating incident. So in my life, we went on this trip. We were obviously all okay. And then we went home. And I've never been on a sailboat since. I'm now in my mid-30s, and it's been 25 plus years. And so I'm not frequently confronted with reminders of that incident. With the exception of when I go to the beach, there are just not a lot of opportunities for me to have to face the negative memory of that experience. And so what that also means is that I don't have to do a lot of accommodating. I haven't had to do a lot of accommodating for that pain. Different than something that maybe I was exposed to in day-to-day life. So if I were abused by somebody that I had to regularly be exposed to, or if the incident happened somewhere like a school, like if I had a trauma happen at school and I had to go back to school every single day for the next 10, 15 years, my brain would have to learn ways to accommodate that pain. And over time, when we accommodate the pain, what happens is that certain parts of our brain get overstrengthened and certain parts of our brain become atrophied. And this ultimately is what presents or leads to PTSD symptoms. So if you think about this again, using that physical injury mentality. So like I said earlier, a single incident trauma would just be you had an injury, it wasn't treated properly, and so it's stored away in your brain with some pain and scar tissue, but it's maybe somewhere that you don't regularly use in your body. So maybe it's like a topical wound, like on your shoulder where you don't frequently rub into, okay? So then PTSD would be you injure something. So let's say you break your ankle, which for most of us is something that we use regularly all day, every day, and is pretty essential to our functioning. And that when we break our ankle, we don't get the treatment that we needed. So then our brain or our body has to heals improperly with scar tissue, or it heals with pain. And so then as we continue to walk on that broken or that poorly healed ankle, we over time have to accommodate for that pain. And so what happens is that certain muscles get overstrengthened and certain muscles get atrophied. And so my very professional way of describing that is that things can get a little wonky. And ultimately, that is what can lead to what we would refer to as PTSD or PTSD symptoms. So I want to talk about one more type of trauma before we move on to attachment, which is complex trauma. And I think it's important. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but it is important to understand it because a lot of times complex trauma and attachment trauma go pretty hand in hand. And so it's important to know the difference. Complex trauma is different in that there is no period of safety after. So if you think about that safety sandwich, this sandwich is open-faced. So what happens is that during that period of safety after the incident, within that 60-day period, a related incident happened. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what related means in a second. So what happens then is that that memory doesn't have the opportunity to consolidate. So it doesn't have the opportunity to form that sort of closed system, that circle. And instead it begins to form a network or a web. So examples of this would be ongoing abuse, certainly systemic oppression or violence, a chronic threat to our safety. If you lived in a war-torn country, or I think our current threat to our safety as far as gun violence goes would definitely be considered that as well. And there's others too. So if you think about my experience, as I told you, in my experience of the boating incident, it was a single incident trauma. Nothing related happened to it afterwards. But let's say it hadn't been. Let's say my life had taken a different turn. What could complex trauma look like in this situation? Well, so let's say in the 60 days after that boating incident, my brother and sister and I were playing, and we're playing baseball, and I take a strong hit at that baseball and I shatter the window in my house. And one of my parents comes out and just berates me. I might have the same thought as I had in that boating incident, which is, it's my fault. Let's say that in that 60-day period after that broken window incident, then I am sexually abused by a coach. And we all know, those of us who work in the field, that a very common negative belief for those who have been sexually abused is, it's my fault. And so instead of having the opportunity for the trauma memory to consolidate, to form that sort of isolated incident bubble, what then happens is that it forms a connected network or a web. And it's stored in the brain in a much more complex way. And so if you think about how each of those traumatic incidences was linked to all of that charged material, the thoughts, the emotions, the images, the body sensations, the sensory material, now we have not just one of those charged, but we have an entire web connected to that. And so the opportunity for someone to be triggered, to be flooded emotionally because of the exposure to something triggering is really prevalent, and it happens really frequently. Meanwhile, also the amount of space that network is taking up in our nervous system and in our brains is significant. And so it then also causes, like we talked about, those other muscles to atrophy. So an example of this would be that, again, we'll go with the broken ankle example. So you break your ankle, but you're a soccer player and you don't get the ankle treated. And not only do you not get the ankle treated, but you keep playing on it. And in every single game that you play, you re-injure your ankle to some degree. What happens is that then the wound, the injury becomes more substantial, and potentially even more wounds are created out of the continued exposure, the continued like sort of poking at that wound. So this is complex trauma. So those are the difference between two types of traumas and how they're stored in the brain. And now I want to move into talking a little bit about attachment with that as a foundation. I also just want to pause and acknowledge the weirdness that is, we're going to talk about something so highly relational and I can't see you. And so I can't get your energy back. I can't feed off of you or kind of see. I recognize that this is a ton of information, and that also it's just skimming the surface of information for a lot of this. So take a deep breath, hang in there, and we're going to keep moving forward and talking about attachment. So attachment by the discoverer or founder of attachment theory, John Bowlby, is defined as a lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. So this is when we're going to get into the lovey-dovey part of the presentation. So John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth began developing and researching attachment theory in the 60s. And the idea behind attachment theory is that humans develop an adaptive behavior, a pattern of adaptive behaviors based on their caregivers' ability to meet their basic needs, as well as how they meet their basic needs when they're met. And that a word adaptive, we're going to come back to several times throughout the presentation. So I really want you to notice that adaptive behavior. Attachment patterns are adaptive to the environment. They are brilliant because they increase our opportunity for survival and they minimize our stress and suffering. What we know about attachment is that without intervention, we continue our attachment style into our adult relationships. And that's the point where some of us would say that those behaviors can become maladaptive. So I hate the word maladaptive personally. I think it's a really negative word for something that at its core was so smart and brilliant of us to figure out. And so I like to say that, that the behaviors then expire. So we learn things in the context of our caregiver relationship as an infant, and we, like research shows, tend to continue those behaviors into adulthood. And without intervention, we replicate those behaviors as relationships change. And at some point, sometimes those skills expire. John Bowlby says that there are three attachment behaviors that babies engage in that are attachment seeking. So we know what Bowlby and Ainsworth realized is that they studied tons and tons and tons and tons of infants and realized that in that first year of life, but especially by the third year of life, that our attachment style, our pattern of behavior that is adaptive to our caregiver was mostly set. And the way that they study that is in studying how does the baby interact with the caregiver and how does the caregiver interact with the baby. So they defined attachment seeking behaviors as three different things in these infants. So the first is that the first attachment behavior is seeking proximity. So babies in their first weeks of life seek, monitor, and maintain proximity to their caregiver. In the youngest of infants, this is just with their eyes. They watch their caregiver as they move throughout the room. And then as they get older, they start doing that more physically, reaching for, turning towards, actually coming towards their caregiver based on where they are in the room. The second attachment behavior is that babies use their caregiver as a secure base. So if you think about it, just being sort of like a true north or a compass, and a healthy baby or a secure attached baby will come to their caregiver for a little bit of nurturing, and then they'll go and explore. If you watch a secure baby on a playground, they'll come and touch base with their caregiver, and then they'll go play a little bit, and they'll come back and they'll go play. And it's just sort of this like almost boomerang idea. So they use their caregiver as a secure base. And the third attachment behavior is that they turn to the caregiver as a safe haven. So they flee to their caregiver when they're afraid, or they turn to their caregiver when they have a need they can't meet themselves. Of course, the most primal version of this, the most early version of this is just babies cry. And so babies cry and they turn and look to their caregiver to meet the need to protect them. And so then on the flip side of that, what makes attachment on the caregiver end? Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson say that secure attachment on a caregiver side is defined as 4 S's: seen, safe, soothed, and secure. So the adult can see their child, not just literally, but also like perceiving the child's needs with empathy and on a deep level. They are able to keep their child safe and avoid doing things that frighten their child. So, and of course that varies culturally and from family to family. They're able to soothe their child, both, practically, physically. If a child is crying because they're hungry, they can feed them, but also if a child is scared or sad, they can soothe them. and that they're secure. The deep knowing that I'm safe and loved here, just as I am. Like this, the deep knowing of security in who you are as a human. So those are the 4 S's that caregivers facilitate in order to create secure attachment. Attachment theory, they went on to develop it further and further. There are several really critical studies. If you are a professional, you're familiar with the stranger study, where the stranger enters the room and the caregiver, they study the child's response to that. There are other studies that over time contributed to what we now know as 4 attachment styles. I do not have time to get into this in depth today, but it is important just for you to hear it. And there are great resources out there for identifying your own attachment style and learning more about the different attachment styles and how they look in both childhood and adulthood. But for the purposes of today, I just want to briefly touch on the 4 different attachment styles. So you can see on this left-hand side over here is the axis of attunement. So on the lower end, it is the caregiver, or on the bottom, I should say, it's not the lower end, higher level of skill. On the bottom of the screen is the caregiver is really attuned to the child's needs. On the top of the screen is the caregiver is avoidant or dismissive of the child's needs. So this could look like ignoring or zoning out due to overwhelm or due to outright just choice to ignore or zone out. And then on this bottom axis down here on the left-hand side, the adult is emotionally regulated. And on the right-hand side, the caregiver is emotionally anxious. And so our ideal form of attachment, if everything were as it should be in the world, would be secure attachment, which is the adult is attuned to the child's needs and emotionally regulated when doing so. So a baby cries, the adult hears the cry, is aware of the cry, and attuned to the child's needs, why they might be crying, and is able to meet that need and soothe them safely and with security without becoming overwhelmed. The next 2 sort of middle of the mix, which I think the majority of us fall into, are our insecure patterns of attachment. Up here would be the adult who is the avoidant attachment style, which is the caregiver is avoidant or dismissive of the child's needs, but apparently regulated while doing so. So the baby cries and the adult ignores the baby, or the baby cries and the adult maybe meets the baby's needs, but is emotionally unavailable during it. So there's no attunement, there's no connection throughout that. The other insecure style is anxious attachment, which is the adult is attuned to the child's needs, but is overwhelmed by them or anxious about them. So the baby cries and the adult has low tolerance for that baby's distress because they are overwhelmed themselves. And then the last style, which is marked by a lack of a pattern, is disorganized attachment, which is when the adult is both the source of nurturing and also the source of fear or danger. And so it's an adult who lacks a pattern in their ability to caregive. And we most frequently see disorganized attachment in abusive caregivers. So like I said earlier, the caregiver is the source of danger and also the source of comfort, which of course is really confusing. And so when we think about attachment styles, again, I'm going to reiterate that they are adaptive. So a baby needs to get their needs met. A baby needs to be seen, secure, safe, and soothed. And so if the caregiver is anxious, if the caregiver is avoidant, the baby adapts his or her behaviors in order to maximize the caregiver's ability to do that. So for example, in an anxious attachment, the baby may learn, when I cry, my caregiver gets really overwhelmed. And so I'm going to learn to suppress my needs, because then I don't have to deal with, or I don't have to expose myself to my caregiver becoming overwhelmed. And so you can see how that sort of that dance back and forth creates over time a pattern of behaviors that then, of course, becomes neural pathways. So that baby learns that when I cry, this happens. And so it's not safe for me to have a need, right? And so I'm going to suppress my need. And you can sort of play that out into adulthood, how that might look. important to notice that the single best predictor of resilience in children exposed to adversity or trauma is the presence of one or more safe, stable, and nurturing caregiver in their life. So we know that if the more secure attachment a child has, that the more resilient they are going to be in the face of trauma. And this is really important to remember as we start to discuss how we treat trauma, specifically with EMDR. And so before we do that, I want to just note too that I know I saw in the chat, a lot of you work in child welfare. And so you are likely working with children and adults who had really horrific abuse or neglect as children. And certainly we would call that attachment trauma. But it's also, attachment trauma can be anything, like Pia Melody would say, that is dysfunctional or anything less than nurturing. So it doesn't always have to be this catastrophic big thing. It just could be that as a baby, as an infant, you deserved, in the healthiest, securest of situations, to have a highly attuned, highly regulated parent. And for whatever reason, maybe even really great reason, you didn't have that. And so attachment trauma is not about the presence of something, but is actually about the absence of something. And so earlier we talked about how when a trauma happens, your brain creates that neural pathway. When we have positive core memories, our brain creates that neural pathway. And what happens when we have attachment deficits, it's not that sometimes there is also a neural pathway created for negative things or for positive things, but it's also that where there should have been a neural pathway, we lack one. And so it's about the absence of nurturing, protective, regulated caregiver relationships. I know at least in the state of Texas, that the number one reason for removal is neglect. And so for children in the child protective system. And so we can assume that for many of the children and for many of our adults, that it is going to be, the trauma is going to be the absence of and not the presence of negative, the absence of nurturing, not the presence of negative, or maybe both, which we're going to talk about in a second. So we talked a little bit earlier about how that trauma looks in a single incident. We talked about how it looks in a complex incident. So how does it look in complex trauma? And so how does it look with attachment trauma? So you'll notice that with attachment trauma, there's a deficit. So these places where there should have been these positive things to buffer the traumatic incident, there's either nothing there, or there's a really weak or fractured connection to those positive things. And so what happens is that then the child or the adult lacks the buffering, lacks the resilience in order to heal and to move forward from the trauma without intervention. So an example of this that I think is really poignant after COVID is somebody who's immunocompromised, that you get an infection that maybe for others would be not life-altering or life-threatening, but because your immune system lacked those critical components to improve your resilience or your outcomes, that infection or that illness became catastrophic to you and life-threatening or life-altering for you. So we talked about single incident trauma, which is you have these positive things and then you have something happen and then you have more positive things, and the brain has the opportunity to consolidate that memory and store it away with other things. We talked about complex trauma, which is when the network occurs because there's not a period of safety after an incident. And now we've talked about attachment trauma, which is when a trauma happens and there is a deficit of positive things before or after. We are lacking nurturing, protection, security in our relationships, particularly with our caregivers. And so now let's talk about what do we do with EMDR to heal those different types of trauma, and how do we adapt based off of the type of trauma and how that presents. So what is EMDR? EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I'm going to break that down for you in just a second. It was discovered by Dr. Francine Shapiro in 1987. She began studying it in 1989 and ultimately was able to validate it by evidence, and it's now considered evidence-based for the treatment of trauma. The way she discovered it is that she was a therapist and she had a chronic health diagnosis. And she noticed that if she focused on the most distressing parts of her experience while moving her eyes really quickly back and forth, that she experienced relief from that pain. And she went on to study it, and she realized that if she continued to do that, that not only did she experience the relief, but also the relief was sustained. So she kept having relief. So at its very core, there are three aspects of EMDR. So I told you to hold on to that word adaptive. And the reason for that is because the model that explains the why behind EMDR and how it works is called the Adaptive Information Processing Model, the AIP model. And the idea behind that is that when we experience a trauma and we have that neural pathway to that charged negative material, our brain learns to adapt to it, just like our brain adapts to our caregiver in attachment styles. And over time, that can create what we now know as trauma symptoms: depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, nightmares, dissociation or avoidance. And that's because, like we talked about earlier, there are some muscles that can get overstrengthened and there are muscles that get atrophied in that traumatic experience. And we know that that is adaptive because our brains are wired for healing and our brains want to experience the least amount of distress possible. So the Adaptive Information Processing Model. The what is that EMDR includes 8 phases of treatment. We're going to focus today on really 2 components of that treatment, which is the desensitization phase, which is the most what we think of when we think of EMDR, and the resourcing phase, which is really, really critical to the treatment of attachment trauma. And then the why, or the how it works, is that we use we facilitate EMDR using what we call bilateral stimulation. So I'm going to break this down in a little bit more layman's terms now. So when Dr. Shapiro created EMDR, like I said, she noticed that she experienced relief when she moved her eyes really quickly back and forth. We now know that the eye movements themselves are a form of bilateral stimulation, which is if you were to draw a line down the center of your body where your spinal cord goes, any sensory stimulation or sensory input that alternates on either side of your body, back and forth, back and forth. So some therapists facilitate EMDR using actual eye movements, which is the eye movement, EM part of the EMDR, which is where the therapist holds her fingers and you follow her fingers with your eyes back and forth. And another form of bilateral stimulation that I frequently use is with using what we would call a tapper. If you can see me in the video, these are little pulsers. They vibrate kind of like a phone vibrates. And we have the client hold the pulsers in either hand and it vibrates back and forth. Why does this work? Because when you go into, on a normal day, when you go into your REM sleep, like we saw in the clip of Inside Out, REM stands for rapid eye movement. So when you're in your REM sleep, your brain naturally engages in bilateral stimulation, which is what allows your brain to process the events of the day and let everything fall into the background. So another way to think of this is almost like a dishwasher cycle. So the events of the day happen, you load up your dishwasher, and you go into your REM sleep and your brain runs the dishwasher cycle of the day. But what happens when, again, we have a traumatic incident is that those memories are not stored in the same way. Like I said, they're stored with charged material connected to them. And so just like if you had a plate that wasn't properly cleaned, when you pull it out the next day, it still has the gunk on it. And so in order to process the traumatic material, we replicate the bilateral stimulation, that eye movements at its origination, or using the buzzies, while you're fully conscious and awake, while asking you to focus on the distressing parts of the incident. So how does that actually work? Because probably if you're like me, when I heard this, I was like, this is a bunch of voodoo science and it makes no sense. It's so weird. So how does it work? So let's go back to that boat incident. Like I said, the boat incident is stored in my brain with all of this charged material. So the negative belief, it's my fault, the emotions of shame and fear, the body sensations of my chest being tight, my arms kind of tingling, and the sensory material and the images. We would ask you, or if I'm the client here, my therapist would say, okay, I want you to focus on the worst part of this incident. So I would say the memory of the image of me underwater, not being able to breathe, and the thought, it's my fault. And we would do the bilateral stimulation, like I said, either the eye movements or the buzzies or some other form of bilateral stimulation, which until your brain had desensitized that. So another way to think about that is by we are cutting the ties to those neural pathways. And the reason that this works and the reason why the bilateral stimulation is so important is because our brains naturally do this in our REM sleep. We are just prompting our brain to do it while we are in our fully conscious state in a way that is that facilitates that desensitization. Once we get the memory down to the point where there's no longer any distress, so we've severed all those ties to that charged material, then the R comes in of EMDR, the reprocessing. We're going to reprocess the memory away in a way that is more adaptive. So we're going to replace all of these negative things with positive things. So when I finished my EMDR work on this particular memory, I had the positive thought instead of I'm capable. I had the feelings of being calm and confident. I had the image of being safe on shore and looking out at them towing the sailboat back in to the shore. This is such a random thing, but I had the very visceral memory of having a milkshake after it was over, a very good one. And I had the body sensations of relief, my shoulders held back, and just sort of like a calm confidence. So we use the bilateral stimulation to support our brain in replicating that natural process to sever those neural connections to those negative parts and to rebuild positive ones instead. And so that then when that memory is processed away into our long-term memory, it's stored in a way that is no longer sensitive. We still remember what happened. As I'm sitting here talking to you today, I remember what happened very vividly, but I can talk about it without being flooded or overwhelmed. It's become a neutral or adaptive part of my memory. And so the basic protocol at its core, if you go back to this image of a single incident, I had all these positive things. So I had a family and friends, and just like Riley had some positive activities and positive personality traits. And then I had this single incident happen, this boating accident happen. The incident was stored away kind of alongside all of these other things. So it didn't greatly impact my day-to-day functioning, but it did impact my willingness to like do things on the water and get on a boat again, et cetera, et cetera. I did EMDR and severed the tie to that negative part of it. And I replaced it with this positive thing. So now no longer do I have this negative charged memory in my brain, but I think of that memory and I know in my core, in my bones, that I am capable. And I just want to, again, recognize that if you've never done EMDR, if you've never heard of it before, this is all very bizarre to think about. And so there is a little bit of experience necessary in order to truly sort of believe and buy in. But ultimately, that is how EMDR works. And that is how research proves that EMDR works, which is a really important component of this. So what happens when we have attachment deficits? As we talked about before, when an attachment or when a trauma happens and there's attachment deficits, there are not resilience factors or not enough resilience factors to support the healing and resilience within that person. And so then what do we do with that? How do we go back and repair what didn't happen and maybe should have happened? What Dr. Laurel Parnell, who is a leading researcher and pioneer in the healing of attachment trauma with EMDR, has proven with research is that when we imagine doing something, the neurons in the brain are activated as if we are actually doing it. And I think this is really hopeful because for many of us, hearing about attachment for ourselves, hearing about attachment trauma for our children or the children we work with, it can be really depressing and it can feel kind of hopeless. When we hear things like our attachment style is determined by the first year of life and really set by the third year of life, I sometimes can feel kind of hopeless about that. And what research shows us is that we can actually engage the imagination to repair what should have happened in those early years. And that is so effective, especially in using bilateral stimulation, that the brain will actually heal itself as if it had happened in real life. And so that's such a foreign concept to think about and so wild, especially for adults to consider how powerful our imagination is. And so I want you to see this video. This is of one of our foster children who was placed with us during the Olympics one year. And she, in this video, is watching Simone Biles on TV. And if you know anything about Simone Biles, you know that she was also adopted from foster care. She's a woman of color, just like our foster daughter was. And I want you to just watch what's happening in this video.
Well, that was a cool one.
So you can see in this video, quite obviously, she is not Simone Biles. And she is not doing anything remotely similar to what Simone Biles is doing in actuality. But she, sure as the sky is blue, thinks she is, right? And if you could hear the sound in the video, I'm not sure if you could, every time she would do a jump, she would say, "That was so cool," or "That was a cool one." And she believed it. She was doing those tumbling passes just like Simone Biles did. And so what's happening in this video in her brain? Like what neural pathways potentially are being created? So first of all, like she's excited, she's having fun, it's happy, it's joyful. Like Simone Biles is about to win like every gold medal under the face of the sun in the Olympics. And so she's happy. She thinks she is amazing, right? After every single tumbling pass that she does, and she literally falls on her butt and says, "Whoa, that was a cool one," right? And so in her brain, she's amazing, like she's the best. She's confident and proud, like falling actually on her butt. And she thinks that she's just nailed it, right? Like, and so she has that feeling of confidence and proud, like, wow, I'm just so incredible at this. She's safe, and she's doing that in the context of relationships. So like, there's this feeling of like, I'm loved and supported to try this thing and to see it and to be amazing, right? There's resilience. Like she's seeing Simone Biles and her resilience. And like, I'm sure she didn't know all of that at her age, but maybe she grows up and she realizes, gosh, when I was a toddler, I loved Simone Biles, and now I know her story. And like, Simone Biles is so resilient and amazing. Maybe I'm also resilient and amazing, right? And then being cheered on, like in her brain, the people cheering in that Olympic audience were cheering for her, right? She thought that she was the one performing, which is so beautiful. So who cares what she was doing, right? Who cares if she's in our living room or if she's on the Olympic stage? Like she's amazing, right? And that happened in her imagination. Excuse me. So how do we get to heal attachment deficits? We have to go back and create what never happened. So if this is the brain with attachment trauma, we go back in with the use of imagination and we fill in what could have happened, what should have happened. And what we know is that act of imagining it with bilateral stimulation is as effective as if it had actually happened. And so then that brain can become that resilient, highly buffered brain that allows something to be just a single incident trauma rather than being a catastrophic thing. And then we can go back and we can do that desensitization, and we can cut ties with the traumatic incident, and we can replace it with something positive instead. And so what does this actually look at like? And you're probably wondering like, well, how do I actually do that? Laurel Parnell, who, like I said, is just the pioneer in treating attachment trauma, would say that there are 4 positive resources that every person needs in order to be able to heal. The first is a safe or calm place. So a place that in our imagination we can go and we can be totally safe and calm. The second is nurturing figures, which is the feeling of being cared for and seen, right? So again, if you think about this, these are the things that we noticed in those 4 S's of attachment. So a nurturing figure, a protector, someone who can keep us safe and secure, someone who can protect us from danger. And the last is an inner wisdom figure, somebody who lets me know that I am okay and secure in who I am. And you'll notice that the images that I chose, none of those are real life caregivers, right? Michelle Obama is, because she has kids, but we're going to assume that none of Michelle Obama's kids are on this webcast right now. And so what's the purpose of that? Why did I choose that? And that's because of that quote, that if we imagine something, it is as effective as actually doing it. So if I can experience nurturing from my dog, if I can connect to the nurturing qualities of my dog, then I have the neural pathway of being nurtured, and I have the neural pathway of nurturing others. If I can connect to what it would be like to be protected by Mrs. Weasley, for our Harry Potter fans out there, then what we know is that we have a neural pathway in there for I know what it's like to be safe in the world. If I can imagine what it would be like to be so safe and secure in myself as Michelle Obama is, then I have a neural pathway in my brain for I'm resilient, I'm inspiring. And it doesn't matter that it didn't exist in real life. Just like that video of our foster daughter. It doesn't matter that she's likely never going to be a Simone Biles, right? It doesn't matter that she's probably never going to go to the Olympics, because in that moment, her brain was firing those neurons and they were wiring together. When I do this, I'm amazing. When I do this, people cheer me on. When I do this, I'm loved and safe and supported. And our brain creates a foundation there that then impacts us later in the future. So how do we do this? Is we go back and we write that in, like that image, right? We create those neural pathways where they wouldn't exist. The other thing that we can do, which I think is just one of the most like beautifully healing things I've done with my clients, is that we can actually invoke the imagination to consider what it would be like to have been parented by the ideal parent. We can go back at different stages of life. We can use the bilateral stimulation, the buzzies or the eye movements, to enhance that experience, that memory, or that image and connection in the brain. And what the brain will do is actually write a script, write a neural pathway in the brain that says, no, this did happen to you. And so some examples of what that's looked like for me has a client who was in foster care in a very neglectful, abused situation, who imagined what it would be like to, as an infant, have been fed and just have her parent gaze in her eyes and with a loving gaze, right? This is so basic, right? Like this is nothing, like it is magical, but it's nothing like extraordinary, right? It's just what we want for our kids and we want for ourselves. And so we can use the bilateral stimulation. We can say, I want you to imagine what it would have been like for you to have been an infant and to have your adoptive mom gaze into your eyes as she fed you. And with the bilateral stimulation, we can actually stimulate the brain to say, let's create a neural pathway. Let's create that core part of your personality that says, I am loved and cherished. I am nurtured. Another example is a client who really loved the Gilmore Girls, also adopted from foster care, and she's a teenager, and she loved to imagine what it would be like to have grown up with a mom who was so accepting as Lorelai. And so she would love to imagine just sitting on the couch, eating junk food with Lorelai Gilmore as her mom, and having that neural pathway experience of like, oh, I'm safe here. I'm okay to be myself. And we can use the bilateral stimulation to enhance that experience. Last example, and this is, I think, maybe the most basic, simple one, is a client who had a lot of food trauma. And for her, the idea of the ideal parent was the feeling of just opening her lunchbox at school and seeing that somebody had thought enough about her to have packed her lunch. And she would imagine that as an elementary, she imagined that at every stage of childhood, and imagine what it would have felt like, imagine what it would have been like. And we did that with the bilateral stimulation. Like I said, what happens from there is that our brain literally writes a script, draws in that connection, maybe where there wasn't one. And so then what happens is that all of those supportive resources fill in the gaps. And what we know is that then just by default, that everything is a little bit more even. You have all this stuff to buffer out that presence of that hard thing, which makes us more resilient. But also then when we sever the connection to that negative thing, when the negative thing goes away, you have this rich, meaningful, full complex neural pathway of all of these positive experiences left. And that is so meaningful and so important for resilience. And so before we break into Q&A, which I'm sure you're like, what in the world is this? This is so weird. I want to just give you a very brief little activity. If you'd like to do it, if you're not in a place to do it, that's okay, no pressure. But if you'd like to just briefly kind of experience, I want to teach the butterfly hug. So the butterfly hug was created by Lucina Artigas. It's currently being used worldwide to facilitate EMDR in group settings, especially with children. It's a way we facilitate the bilateral stimulation virtually. And like I said, if there are multiple clients with one therapist. So if you'll take your hands and cross gently over your chest like this, you can kind of hook your thumbs right here if you'd like. And you're just going to tap very slowly and very lightly on your chest. So pause for a second, and I want you to just think of something that has happened in the last maybe couple of days that brought you joy. Maybe it was something as simple as like you had a really good lunch today, or maybe a friend brought you an unexpected treat at work. And just take a second and connect to the joy in that moment. Notice it in your body. And now I just want you to lightly tap. Take a deep breath. What hopefully happened for you then is that you had the enhanced experience of experiencing that joy and connecting in that moment. And maybe you felt it in your body in a different way. And so I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation there. I can already see some questions coming in, and I'll open it up to some Q&A, and I'm going to put my contact information here on the last screen as well. So if you have questions, if you're interested in EMDR or want to dive deeper into any of these concepts, I hope you'll reach out, but I'll also jump into answering any of the questions that came in. Okay. So the first question I'm seeing is, where does chronic trauma fall? And I think that that's just a little bit of a semantics thing. Chronic trauma and complex trauma is essentially the same thing. So again, if you think back on that definition, complex or chronic trauma is when a trauma happens and then a related incident happens within that 60-day period after. I gave the example in my presentation of related incidents being things that happened that were the same negative belief. In my case, it's my fault, but it can also be the same type of trauma happening over and over again. So of course, for our kids that experience chronic sexual abuse or people who are living in a domestic violence relationship, those would be examples of chronic or complex trauma. It says, quick, just, I guess, housekeeping note. I think that the slideshows will be shown with the recording, but I can also provide that for anybody who wants it. Somebody asked if you can do EMDR successfully through telehealth. The answer is yes. like I said, you can do the butterfly hug. There's also some software that exists where there's a dot on the screen and it goes back and forth, and on the person who's doing the EMDR follows it with their eyeballs. We don't have enough evidence yet to prove the efficacy of or virtual EMDR versus in person, mostly just because it hasn't been long enough that we've been doing it. But I can tell you that I've had experience doing telehealth as the therapist and as the client, and I do find it to be effective. Although just personally, I don't prefer it. I would always prefer in person if it were up to me. So the next question is the ideal parent situation. Was a question about the ideal parent situation. Does it make someone feel depressed or sad if they didn't have that? And someone said, and she said, my brain can't compute this. Yes, sometimes doing this resourcing work can be really overwhelming. It's really common in doing these resources for somebody to become flooded or to become sort of overwhelmed with the positive experience of it. And talking about attachment innately, I think is hard for people. And I want to normalize that. If you heard and hearing me talk about any of that, if it felt overwhelming or it felt upsetting, that is a normal response. It's also why I emphasize so much that attachment is adaptive, that there's nothing wrong with you, that you didn't do anything wrong if you don't have secure attachment. I have met few people in my life that have it. Most people have some form of insecure attachment, and many of my clients have disorganized attachment. So that's all really common. Somebody said, how does this work with repressed memories? That's a really, it's complicated because EMDR, the purpose of EMDR is not to remember things that you don't, it's not to like stir up memories that you don't have access to. It would be getting into too complex to talk more about dissociation and how that impacts EMDR, but there are many ways to successfully do EMDR with people who have very pronounced dissociation and dissociation disorders. Like I said, I think that that's too complex for today. But just know that one of the reasons why EMDR is effective is because it accesses this long-term memory in the back of your brain. And the part of our brain that we access by just sitting and talking is this cortex, the front of our brain. And so you could spend years and years and years talking about a memory, and then with EMDR experience relief in as little as just a few sessions. I also like that example of like, when I started the work on that boating accident, I didn't really remember anything about after what happened. Like I just very prominently remembered the accident itself and like being in the water. And now when I think of that incident, the number one thing that comes to mind is the milkshake. And like, I had no memory of the milkshake before I did that work. So it's not that I necessarily repressed it. It's just that maybe it wasn't as close to the surface as the other stuff. So it is common for that to be the case where like certain parts of the memory or certain connected memories might arise, but it's not the goal, if that makes sense. Somebody asked, I love this question, can you describe the results of any or all of the examples that I gave about resourcing? Like a foster dad gazing into a baby's eyes, the Gilmore Girls mom, or the nice lunches. How did I, as the therapist, know that they were effective, and how were my clients better after this treatment? I think that that's such a great question. I, in the moment, knew, because it's partly why I'm like feel so weird about this presentation style, because I can't see any of you and I can't feel your energy. Part of why I knew it worked in the moment is because I could sense in the room the energy and the connection between them. But also we know that the way that we know EMDR is effective is because it alleviates trauma symptoms. So there are evidence-based assessments that we can give that are normed for age and gender and various things that will measure trauma symptoms before intervention and measure trauma symptoms after intervention. So I can know just in my gut and my intuition that it worked because I can experience this client differently. And if it's a kid, the parent is reporting that some of the things that they were concerned about behaviorally or otherwise are are gone or different, but I also know because I can administer an assessment and that the results of the assessment may prove more statistically or with data that the client no longer meets criteria for PTSD, for example, which is often the case. So when I worked at New Friends, New Life, like I said, with victims of sex trafficking and their children, we most commonly used the PCL-5, which is an evidence-based assessment for PTSD symptoms. And we would administer that pre-treatment. So right when the client came in, we would administer it again mid-treatment. So usually right before we started processing trauma, right before we started EMDR, and then we would administer when the client completed treatment. And it was very common for a client to experience a drastic lowering of symptoms to the point where they would no longer meet criteria in the DSM for PTSD. So that's where the evidence-based component of EMDR comes in, which I think is really important. Let's see, a lot of folks saying how they enjoy bilateral stimulation, giving some other examples of bilateral stimulation like walking, drumming. So again, just reminding you that just because we most frequently use eye movements and the buzzies in our sessions as therapists doesn't mean it's the only method of bilateral stimulation. And there are plenty of examples from other cultures and from history of where bilateral stimulation has been effective. I think two really common ones that I like to note are drum circles. So in many cultures, drum circles are a very significant part of connection and healing. And if you think about it, drumming is bilateral stimulation. I'm hitting the drum on opposite sides of my body. Same if you think about, if you're a runner, I am not, I hate running, but for those of you who love it, you've experienced the runner's high, then you can know that running is also bilateral stimulation. I'm switching over to the chat because I see that there's some questions here too. So let me see if I can catch those. Great question. Does the person have to know the specific trauma to benefit from EMDR? Meaning that if it isn't a single traumatic incident, but is a web of trauma, it might be a combo of small T traumas. Yes and no. So what is necessary in EMDR is for the client to be able to identify a negative belief. And so even though they might not say like, this is the thing that happened that set everything off, if we can get to, so in EMDR, what we would do is we'd say, okay, what's the negative belief that's coming up for you? And so they might say, I'm overwhelmed frequently by the belief, I'm not good enough. And I will say, okay, I want you to trace that back into your memory to the very first time you remember thinking that. And sometimes that's something that's a very kind of what we would say obvious trauma, right? Like abuse or an assault of some sort. But often it's not. Often it's something that we would not consider to be sort of like on paper, upsetting, but the experience of it was really upsetting because if you go back to that original quote, it overwhelmed the person's ability to cope. And so we will get there as long as the person can connect to the negative belief, then we can do EMDR. Somebody asked, do the 8 phases of EMDR mean 8 sessions? Also a great question. Short answer, no, it does not. 8 phases just means that there are sort of 8 steps to the treatment protocol. The reason why I think it's important to talk about that is because when we talk about EMDR, we most often think of desensitization. So that severing of the tie to the negative material. And I think it's really important to know that there are 8 total phases, and particularly with attachment trauma, that one of those phases is resourcing, which is critical to healing from attachment trauma. That you cannot heal from attachment trauma if you haven't gone in and filled in those deficits or those gaps like we talked about in the resourcing phase. Let's see what else. Somebody said, thank you for the training. Could we use this strategy when working with children's teens who did not get a supportive, believing response from caregivers when they outcry about abuse? Absolutely, yes. So love this question. I think what he's referring to is when a child outcries, especially to a caregiver, and that caregiver is either invalidating or non-believing. So a child comes to the caregiver and says, hey, Uncle Tom has been sexually abusing me for a while now. And the caregiver's response is either, no, he didn't, he's such a great guy, or, well, what did you do to deserve that? Something negative, right? And the reason why we can use that is because ultimately what happens there is likely that response from caregiver will turn into a negative belief. And so that would be the presence of the trauma. But also then we can assume that there are some attachment deficits if a caregiver is not safe, seen, supportive, and secure when they respond to the outcry of abuse. So we can also go back and repair. And this is where imagination can come in, because we can have the child in EMDR imagine what it would have been like to have received a validating and supportive response from caregiver, and rewrite that in a way that feels adaptive. So yes, absolutely. I've used this in sessions with clients and it's been really great. Okay, let's see if I'm missing anything else. I think I got that one. Somebody asked about the use of, it looks like a medication with EMDR, and I don't know how to answer that. So I'm sorry that I don't know the answer to that. Let's see, let's see. EMDR did not work for my son, but was transformative for my daughter. Do you know the average success rate of EMDR? I don't actually. I don't know how easy or hard it would be to research that, like the efficacy or why it would work for some people and maybe why it doesn't work for others. I will say that in my experience, the sort of main reasons why EMDR isn't a good fit for some people are because they lack the support resources or lack the resources in their life. So like we talked about the deficits, which might be because of attachment or might be because of other things. And many EMDR therapists who are just basic trained do not spend a ton of time on that resourcing component, because the basic training, the basic standard protocol doesn't emphasize that component of EMDR. So that might be a reason why. It's why I think that learning this attachment focused, like sort of deficit approach, or like filling in deficits approach to EMDR is super important. So that's one reason why I think it doesn't work for some people. It can be really challenging for people with dissociative disorders or like severe dissociation, and does require extra training and competence from a therapist. The other thing that happens fairly frequently is if a person is trying to process something that they don't have felt safety from. So again, if we know that the brain is wired for survival and for minimizing stress and suffering, and our responses to trauma and our responses to danger or to lack of nurturing are adaptive, then when we try to challenge those responses, when we still have exposure to that caregiver or exposure to that threat, our brain is unable to, at times, sort of rewire itself, because our brain's ability to protect ourselves is so incredibly strong, which is kind of unbelievable if you think about it. So that's sort of the reasons why I see it not working, but I'm sure there are others, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who it just wasn't a good fit for. But in my clinical experience, those are sort of the reasons why I see it doesn't work. This person says, my adult son experienced a traumatic incident in an accident with his wife. Interestingly, he is a drummer. Could he be experiencing the bilateral treatment incidentally, or does it need to be in a therapeutic setting? That's a little bit of a tricky question. He certainly could be. I think that if that it's possible that if it's a single incident trauma and he's doing that drumming and he sort of is naturally engaging in the process, that his brain could process it in a way so that it was stored without trauma. There are also plenty of other reasons why people's experiences that seem traumatic get stored away in ways that aren't traumatic. Like, it's why I was really clear to sort of start this presentation by saying there is no comprehensive list of things that are traumatic and things that aren't traumatic. The thing that differentiates is the negative belief. So if he had an upsetting incident and there's no negative belief attached to it, then we would not consider that to be traumatic. And so he may not need EMDR. He might not need to process it. It's also possible that his brain just naturally, like I said, our brains are incredible. They're wired for healing, that he naturally figured that out and the drumming helped him. I just want to put the disclaimer that I would never recommend or suggest that somebody do EMDR on their own or try to self-administer EMDR. It's not a safe thing to do on your own, and you need somebody who is skilled to be able to do that. And in person. But if it happens sort of naturally, then great. That's awesome. Our brains are amazing, right? Sort of connected to that, somebody asked, do you need to be certified in EMDR in order to practice it? Thank you for asking that. So there are multiple levels of EMDR training and certification. The most basic level is just what we would say is EMDR basic trained. So that is a person who has completed like a almost 100-hour training and has done some consultation and done some sessions in the meantime. You can be EMDR basic trained before you're fully licensed as a clinician. You cannot be EMDR basic trained if you are not in the process of becoming a licensed mental health professional. After basic training, you can pursue certification. The requirements for that are that you be a fully independently licensed mental health provider. So in my state, Texas, that would be either a licensed clinical social worker, a licensed professional counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist, no associates. So you'd have to have that fully licensed independent license. And you have done at least 75 sessions with, or maybe it's, no, 75 sessions with, I think, 25 individual clients. So they've done a substantial amount, and they've done 20 hours of consultation with an EMDR consultant. And then after that, you can go on to be an EMDR consultant, which is what the level of certification that I have, which is where you have done EMDR with at least 75 individual clients, and you've done some specific consultation on teaching, so consultation on consultation. And so now I am certified in order to be able to teach and train other like people who are pursuing certification. And then the last level would be an EMDR trainer. So somebody who is approved to be able to facilitate basic training. The governing body for EMDR is the EMDR International Association. If you're ever curious about EMDR, they have an amazing library of resources, and they also have a really comprehensive Find a Therapist feature. So you can go on their website, indria.org, and I'll type that right here. And do the Find a Therapist, and you can do it by zip code, and you can like put in all these different filters in order to find a therapist that's a good fit for you. And I generally find that to be a really helpful tool, because you know that if somebody's on the EMDRIA website, that they have gone through an EMDR International Association approved training course, and they are like, they've gotten the gold stamp. So great question. I would be extremely, extremely hesitant to do EMDR with anybody who did not have any training that are similar to that. So